Every death of every partner is very influenced by the type of death it was, the kind of relationship the couple had with each other. If they had a very close relationship where they did everything together, then it would be much more difficult for that couple to adapt to a life without the partner. And maybe they always thought, I'll die first for my partner. Even that kind of thought can affect how you react to it. So I suppose, but primarily the first reaction to the death of a partner is one of shock followed by sadness. And I suppose the throes of grief, Conor Murray Parks, who's a very famous writer on bereavement, spoke about the throes of grief, and that's really when you're in your grief, when you're really in it and you can't think about anything else. I suppose the other common things that happen when someone's grieving for a partner is that they're searching for them very often, going to places that they went together, and maybe then they might be having a good day and suddenly the whole memory gets triggered because they hear a piece of music or they see something that reminds them of the partner, and the loss hits them all over again. So I suppose that they're the kind of major reactions somebody has. But we've really moved away from that now, and we don't want to write out a prescription for anyone to follow their grief. We really want to help people to see that it's very much an individual, unique journey, and that each person makes it in their own way, and there is no prescribed route to it. There's no right way to do it. And I think the difficulty was that when people were following set stages, they actually felt, am I really not getting better because I haven't gone through a state of denial or grief or anger or whatever, and they couldn't recognise themselves in it, or they saw themselves in it too much. And we just really want to say to people very clearly, there is no right way to do this, that it's influenced by so many factors, but primarily it's influenced by the kind of relationship you have with the person who died. I think it's one of the things that makes people feel abnormal sometimes in grief, or think there's something really wrong with them, is that when they think, I was very sad for 6 months or a year and I'm not too bad. The point is that people may go through another phase of huge sadness again, and they often think, God, I'm going back the way, I'm really regressing. But in fact, that's a very normal thing to happen. It's usually triggered by some event. One of the things I know a lot of couples I work with and a lot of partners I work with whose partner has died is that they often make a big effort to get ready for certain events like Christmas or anniversaries or birthdays, and then they actually get through that day okay, but it's the weeks after it, because it takes such energy to get ready for it, that they often think, I'm worse than ever again. I suppose a very important thing for bereaved partners and spouses to understand is that bereavement is an experience and not a state. What I mean by that is that it's an experience that's constantly changing, so you're not bereaved intensely forever. It's changing all the time, and that the people do retain hope, that they retain that hope that things will get a bit better, because we know from experience and from talking to grieving people that it does get a bit better over time. The people get used to it, but they don't stay in that intense state of grief unless it goes wrong in some way. Nowadays we talk about complicated grief, or grief that's prolonged in some way, because people often ask me, how long should I be really sad for? And of course there's no answer to that question. But I suppose generally kind of the research tells us that we would have an expectation that people would certainly see a fairly significant improvement in the day-to-day coping and their functioning probably 2 or 3 years after the death of a partner. You would expect the situation to improve around that time. Gradually, it's not they won't have bad days, but they start to have more good days than bad days. I suppose when it gets complicated is when their grief is prolonged in some way, maybe because they had a very dependent relationship with the person who died. Maybe their personality is such that they don't believe in themselves. Maybe their self-esteem is low anyway. If there was a lot of dependency in the relationship, if they never thought they could live without their partner, that would certainly be difficult. I think for men, a particularly at-risk group of men are men who are aged between 55 and 70, who maybe had a very close relationship with their wife, and then the roles change and you're suddenly on your own. Maybe you're minding children and you think, I'm not really equipped to do that. I suppose one of the fascinating things about bereavement, and I think it's a time of great resilience for a lot of people, because they'll say to themselves, or they often say to people like me, if someone told me I would have done this well, I wouldn't have believed them. So they actually find an inner strength that they thought they didn't have or didn't realise. So I think it's often a time of great learning in the midst of all the sadness. I suppose it always also becomes complicated if there's a substantial amount of guilt or anger in the relationship that hasn't been resolved in some way. And I think a lot of people that I see who have poor social support, I don't mean being surrounded by hundreds of people, I mean just having one or two people you really can rely on. People who have a lot of concurrent crisis, and what I mean by that is that maybe there's several things happening together. Like, if they lose their partner, and it means losing their house as well, or changing their home in some way, or if it coincides with adolescence, or if it coincides maybe with a parent dying as well at the same time, all of those things happening together, I suppose really draw on the person's resources to deal with stress. And that is core bereavement of a partner is a stressful life event. That's what it is. And I suppose some people have more resources to cope with than others. So it's a bit like a train journey. There are lots of stations on the way, and sometimes people get on those stations who do challenge us, maybe because they're not very kind, or they say things that they don't mean, but it's very hurtful to say them. And maybe there's a huge pressure from society to get better very quickly, and I say get better in inverted commas because I don't think people recover from grief. I think they adapt to it over time. Sometimes society and friends and families don't want to see you always sad, or don't want to see you so upset, so there's a pressure on to kind of go back to the way you were before it happened. I think as well that there was a myth for a long time that the first anniversary, that if you got through it, it was like a big milestone, and yet we know now from the research all over the world that the second year, particularly up to 18 months after the death, can be a really challenging time, because I suppose the reality of the loss dawns that it's forever. The biggest challenge for a lot of people is loneliness. Not the loneliness of not having people around, because lots of them had very good support, but it's the loneliness of the loss of an intimate relationship, the loss of your best friend, sometimes the loss of a person you can be quiet with or you can talk to, and it really makes no difference. I suppose somebody who loves you unconditionally, who takes you warts and all, and we all have warts, and I suppose that's for me, in my experience, that's the most prominent thing that people talk about being really difficult, is that loss of, that whole thing about just the loneliness of the loss of that relationship. Bereavement here is a time when loads of people give you advice, and they're all giving it for the very best of reasons, but they're all giving because they're biased, because it's what worked for them. And some people say go to the grave every day, and some people say don't go at all. And you have to find your own level in your grief. You have to find what works for me well. So that's the main piece of advice. The second big piece of advice that I think is really important to prevent difficulties is that you pick out one or two good friends that you can rely on. You don't need 50 friends. You just need one or two that will be okay to be around when you're having a bad day or if you're having a good day. I suppose some people who are not judgmental, it's good to be around people like that who don't think, she's over it because she looks well. I mean, nobody knows, even though you look well on the outside, you might be feeling awful inside. I think it's very important not to make any major life changes for at least 18 months or 2 years after the death. I think because you have to take into account that you're making those changes at a time of great stress. Talking out your feelings, because sometimes when you start to actually verbalise how you feel, it makes the problem more manageable. We know now, for example, for years we thought that bereavement was kind of a passive process, that it just happened to somebody and you just went through it. Whereas we know from kind of more recent research that bereavement is very much about being actively involved in it. And I suppose people start to make those decisions from the time someone dies. What will I lay somebody out and what kind of ritual will I have around the funeral? And I suppose it's to stay with that, to kind of structure their lives that way. Take a small, tiny bit of exercise every day if they can. Do things that they like doing, be good to themselves. But I suppose the most important thing is that over time, I do believe that people develop relationships with people, different relationships when someone dies. So it's that you're changing the relationship you have with the person that you loved, and you're changing to something else. So for example, it might be that you can't talk to that person, or they can't talk back to you at least, but it may be that you can ask them for advice. You could say, what would they think about this, or I'll do this for this person. And that gives a huge amount of solace to people who are grieving their partner, the whole idea that they still have a relationship even though it's fundamentally changed. It isn't what they want, it isn't what it's set out to get, but there's a huge sense of kind of relief and solace when you think that person still influences me. But I suppose the whole idea that that person's life was very meaningful, and it doesn't stop being meaningful just because they die.